Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming, and also to our audience on Zoom. You're very welcome. My name is Joseph Cronin. I'm the director of the Leo Baeck Institute, London. This is the first lecture in our annual lecture series. So we're very excited to be starting a new series in collaboration with the German Historical Institute London, our long-term collaborator on this lecture series. And I'm delighted that Dr. Indra Sengupta is representing the Institute with us this evening. Indra, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, Dr. Cronin, for handing over the microphone to me. So a very warm welcome to everybody. Also from me, I'm here to represent our director, Professor Dr. Christina von Hodenberg, who unfortunately cannot be present today. And it's more than a pleasure to be here because the topic of this lecture, the topic of the series and of this lecture is of great personal interest, both to me and institutional interest to the German Historical Institute. So with those words, I'm looking forward very much to your talk, Dr. Roy, this evening, and a very warm welcome to all of you here in the room, and also those of you who have joined us this evening online. So enjoy the evening, and I'm sure it'll be a delightful lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sengupta. So without further ado, this evening we are delighted to be welcoming Dr. Baijayanti Roy. Dr. Roy is a postdoctoral researcher affiliated to the Goethe University, in Frankfurt, where she's part of the Arbeitsgruppe Wissenschaftsgeschichte, or the study group for the history of science. Her research interests center around the connections between India, which is the country of her birth, and Germany, the country of her country of residence. Her present research focuses primarily on the history of German Indology from the late 19th to the mid-20th century. She has a monograph on the subject forthcoming with Oxford University Press, which is titled The Nazi Study of India and Indian Anti-Colonialism, Knowledge Providers and Propagandists in the Third Reich, which we are greatly looking forward to reading. I believe it's coming out in September this year or later this year. Her first monograph, which was published in 2016, was on a rather different, somewhat different topic. It was titled The Making of a Gentleman Nazi, Albert Speer's Politics of History in the Federal Republic of Germany. And she published on a range of other topics, broadly concerning either Nazi Germany or the intersections between Germany and India. These include the attractions of Eagle's Nest, Hitler's tea house, the trajectory of the Indologist Heinrich Zimmer in the Third Reich, about which we will hear more this evening, and the state of knowledge about the Holocaust in present-day India. Prior to becoming an academic, Dr. Roy worked as a journalist in India, and she remains a keen observer of Indian politics. So we'll all have to resist the temptation to ask her about the general election in India, which is currently, I think, taking place maybe at the drinks reception afterwards. Anyway, I'm sure you will all join me in extending a very warm welcome to Dr. Baijayanti Roy.
Thank you for this wonderful, warm introduction. And of course, thank you for inviting me to deliver this very, very important lecture. I mean, important for me. Yeah, as Joseph said, that this talk is really based on an article that I published a few years ago in a German journal. The article, written in English, owes its origin to something of a side quest that I undertook in course of my research on the project Indology in National Socialist Germany, on which my forthcoming monograph is based. So tracing the complications in the life story of Heinrich Zimmer was indeed a side quest, since Zimmer was not really relevant for my research. My research focuses on German Indologists or scholars specializing on India who were complicit with the Nazis. I had no reason to investigate Herr Zimmer, since he is known to be a victim of the Nazi regime. This side quest started when I received the information that a correspondence between Heinrich Zimmer and a lady called Mila Esslinger, with whom he had a long extramarital relationship and 3 children, has arrived at the German Literature Archives at Marbach. I was informed that the correspondence had interesting stuff related to the years of Nazi rule. My curiosity was piqued and I decided to travel to Marbach, also because it is a picturesque town on the river Neckar. When I read the correspondence at the archives, I was surprised and shocked, since it complicated not only the established life story of Zimmer, but also the conventional binary of collaborator and victim as far as the Nazi persecution of the Jewish people or people whom the Nazis construed as Jews are concerned. I found this episode so intriguing that I decided to look up Zimmer's files, or Nachlass as they say in German, at the University of Heidelberg, which added a number of other complexities to this story. Well, I also love to visit Heidelberg, another lovely old town on the Neckar, as Dr. Sengupta here will also tell you. A brief biographical sketch of Heinrich Zimmer is in order here. Heinrich Zimmer, 1890-1943, was the son of the Keltologist or specialist in Celtic studies and Indologist Heinrich Zimmer Sr., 1851-1910. Zimmer Jr. obtained his PhD in Indology from the University of Berlin in 1914. He fought in the First World War as a volunteer. He completed his Habilitation, or the second thesis required by German universities for getting professorships, from the University of Greifswald in 1920. In 1922, he joined the University of Heidelberg, where he started to teach in an untenured position with a modest stipend. In 1926, he was given the honorary title of professor, though he was not given tenure. In 1928, Zimmer married Christiane von Hofmannsthal, daughter of the famous Austrian poet and librettist Hugo von Hofmannsthal. The couple had 4 children, 3 of whom survived into adulthood. Hugo von Hofmannsthal's family had converted from Jewish Orthodox to Catholic faith a generation back. So Nazi racial policy categorized Christiane as a first-grade Mischling or mixed blood, since both her maternal grandparents were, within quotes, fully Jewish. Hence, Zimmer, a so-called Aryan, was, according to Nazi parlance, Jüdisch versippt, which in this context means that he was in an undesirable marriage with a Jew. As the scale of persecution of the Jews was stepped up over the years, Zimmer's professional situation became increasingly precarious, culminating in the revocation of his venia legendi, or teaching license, which comes with habilitation, as well as the honorary title of professor in 1938. However, Zimmer succeeded in moving to England with his family in March 1939. The family moved to New York in 1940, where Zimmer lectured on Indian philosophy as a visiting professor in Columbia University. Just as he was about to get a non-tenured faculty position there, he died of a lung infection in March 1943. Now, this biography of Heinrich Zimmer is well known. I will talk here about a number of not so well-known aspects which complicate Zimmer's life story by demonstrating that he occupied a liminal space between victimhood and collaboration. In this sense, one could actually call him an outsider. In the draft of his unfinished memoirs, tentatively titled Notizen zu einem Lebenslauf, or Notes on a Resume, written in America shortly before his death, Zimmer stated that he was, I quote, decisively and hopelessly apolitical, unquote. He conveyed the impression that he spent his life in a perpetual inner exile, removed from the political currents of his time. The description of his youth, particularly his comments about his research guide Heinrich, the famous professor of Indology at what is now Humboldt University in Berlin, who was a member of the conservative nationalist Deutsche Nationale Volkspartei or DNVP, seemed to indicate that Zimmer possessed a streak of anti-authoritarianism. Zimmer wrote in the draft that after the First World War, he became mentally free of the generation of his academic predecessors, whose scholarship was focused solely on philology and positivism. To quote the scholar Wendy Doniger, these German scholars, mostly they were men, but they were people obsessed with nouns and verbs, and whose politics had brought a disastrous war upon the country. Zimmer claimed that he broke away from this milieu, delving instead into the inner workings of Indian philosophy, literature, myth, and art, a transgression for which his research guide never forgave him. Now, memoirs, as we know, are notoriously unreliable. However, there seems to be some reason to believe that Zimmer did display certain anti-authoritarian tendencies in his youth, since the Nazi authorities at the state of Baden, to which Heidelberg belongs, strongly suspected Zimmer of having connections with left-wing political circles. This was a criminal offense for the Nazis, since all shades of leftist politics were anathema to them. In August 1933, the Ministry of Education of the state of Baden sent the police to spy on Zimmer. The stated aim of the ministry was to check whether one could use the law passed on 7th April 1933 against Zimmer. This law was euphemistically called the Law for the Rearrangement of the Professional Civil Servants. Actually, it allowed the Nazi regime to remove those who it considered to be racially and politically unreliable from the civil service. When the local police could not find any incriminating evidence against Zimmer, the ministry asked the rector of the University of Heidelberg to find out whether actions could be taken against Zimmer on account of his politics. The rector at the time was the pro-Nazi legal scholar Wilhelm Groh, who duly complied. In a letter to the ministry, an informant who signed as G, probably Groh himself, wrote that he had heard from the chancellor of the university that though Zimmer leads a quiet and low-key existence at present, it is beyond doubt that earlier in his life he had associated with leftist circles. In answer to a renewed inquiry a year later, G informed the ministry officials that he had heard from the chancellor that Zimmer made, I quote, oppositional remarks, unquote, about the Nazi regime, but the chancellor could not offer any proof to support this claim. The same question and answer pattern was repeated in 1935, to which G also added a secret report on Zimmer written by a certain Professor Stein. It is very likely that this Professor Stein was none other than the pro-rector of the university, Johannes Stein, professor of medicine, director of the university clinic, member of the SS, as well as the head of the National Socialist Teachers Association at the university. So this kind of multi-functionaries were the academics who made good career progress under the Nazis. The persistence of this question-answer pattern indicates that Zimmer had possibly displayed some interest in left-leaning politics in his student days in Berlin. But it also appeared that he had changed his political views after coming to Heidelberg. Such a transformation, as we will see, was not uncharacteristic for Zimmer. At Heidelberg, Zimmer was part of a circle of young academics. The group called itself in Calcutta in Latin, means not calcified. This group was politically oriented towards conservative German nationalism. In any case, it was not his doomed leftist leanings, but his wife's Jewish ancestry that made Zimmer's situation increasingly precarious, especially after the proclamation of the Nuremberg race laws in 1935. Already in 1934, Stein had informed Director Groh that Zimmer was not married to an Aryan, and one could not treat Zimmer differently than the others who were in a similar situation. Zimmer's fate, he added, I quote, would be a hard but necessary one, unquote. Till 1935, however, Zimmer's situation was somewhat unstable, but the Nazi authorities had not taken any concrete steps against him. This was due to reasons of Kulturpolitik or cultural diplomacy. The Nazi regime was still sensitive to international public opinion. Since Zimmer was an internationally known scholar, the regime did not want to tarnish its image in the eyes of the world by ousting him. Also, during this period, the Nazi authorities felt that it was not yet appropriate to take direct measures against prominent persons of Jewish origin, like the daughter of a cultural icon like Hugo von Hofmannsthal. Another factor that contributed to the initial reticence of the authorities was the ambivalence of the Nazis regarding the so-called mixed marriages, at least in the first 3 or 4 years of their rule. Such marriages represented a unique challenge to the Nazi regime. On the one hand, such, within quotes, intermarriages were affronts to the Nazi ideal of a racially pure and homogeneous national community or Volksgemeinschaft. On the other hand, the regime was reluctant, at least in the initial years, to provoke protests and dissent by breaking up families, since the dictatorship needed a degree of domestic peace and popular support. Moreover, the authorities of the University of Heidelberg, as well as the Ministry of Education in Baden, were only too aware that at this point there was no legal foundation for the dismissal of the so-called Jüdisch versipped professors. Similar considerations delayed the dismissal of the famous professor of philosophy, Karl Jaspers, whose wife was considered to be, within quotes, fully Jewish. The eventual expulsion of Jaspers in September 1937 was presented as voluntary retirement on grounds of ill health by the Ministry of Education, which ensured the philosopher a pension. Dark clouds were, however, gathering on the horizon. From about 1936, the university authorities seem to have quietly begun preparing for Zimmer's eventual dismissal. From the winter semester of 1936-37, Hermann Guntert, the pro-Nazi specialist of German language and Indo-European religion, began to lecture regularly on ancient Indian themes, which generally belonged to Zimmer's teaching area. This move was in all likelihood aimed to marginalize Zimmer. Between 1936 and 1939, the regime radicalized its racial politics by increasing its persecution of Jews. This was the time when the Nazis achieved a remarkable degree of control over the University of Heidelberg. Such control was established, in the words of the historian Stephen P. Ramey, I quote, by imposition from above and accommodation and acquiescence from below, unquote. The acquiescence is not surprising, since most members of the teaching faculty of this university who engaged in party politics during the 1920s generally belonged to one of the 4 right-wing parties that espoused different degrees of German nationalism and anti-Semitism. These parties were Deutsche Staatspartei, Deutschnationale Volkspartei, Vaterlandspartei, and of course the National Socialists. Abetting the Nazi regime after 1933, therefore, did not require any radical transformation on their part. From 1937, the consolidation of political power by the Nazi regime emboldened it enough to feel that the Reich did not need to take any further notice of international opinion. This is reflected in a secret report of the Ministry of Education of Baden, dated 18th March 1937. It states that the factors working in Zimmer's favor so far, his reticence regarding political activities, his record as a soldier in the First World War, as well as the circumstances which required not taking any measures that directly affected the daughter of a celebrated poet, all these factors could be disregarded from now on. The background to this report was the passing of the German Civil Servants Law on 21st January 1937, which stipulated that not only the civil servants but also their spouses needed to be Reichsbürger or citizen and not Staatsbürger or subjects. The result was another round of purges in the civil service, the victims of which included both Jaspers and Zimmer. The Central Education Ministry in Berlin revoked Zimmer's Venia Legendi as well as his title of professor on 31st March 1938. Meanwhile, Zimmer's mobility was increasingly restricted. As he sought permission from the Ministry of Education in Berlin in October 1936 to undertake an educational trip to India in 1937 as an academic guide or wissenschaftliche Leiter of a travel group, his request was turned down. Officials from Berlin informed the University of Heidelberg that since Zimmer was married to a woman not of German blood, this is within quotes, he was unsuitable for this role. The Ministry of Education, however, instructed the rector of the university not to divulge the real reason for the rejection to Zimmer. This is evident from the letter of protest that the then rector Ernst Krieg sent to the ministry in reply. And the protest was not out of sympathy for Zimmer. Krieg, a committed National Socialist, was concerned that Nazi Germany's international reputation would suffer. He claimed that even if Zimmer was not told about the actual cause of the refusal, there was the danger that it would become internationally known through other ways and the standing of German academia would be compromised. So till the end of February 1937, Zimmer was not officially informed by the ministry about the ground for this denial. By the time the official answer, which openly declared Zimmer's so-called Jewish kinship or jüdische Versippung as the ground for the denial of permission, by the time it reached Zimmer, the travel date was long past. Zimmer had complained unsuccessfully in January 1937 to the Dean of the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Heidelberg about the delay of the ministry in answering his application. What is interesting about this letter is that the letter that Zimmer sent to the Dean is that he ended it with the salutation Heil Hitler. This brings me to the political compromises that Zimmer made during this time, a subject which has received little attention from historians. Zimmer tried in different ways to answer the demands and expectations of the regime. He perceived early on that the Nazi authorities were aware of or suspected him of harboring left-wing sympathies, which could have life-threatening consequences for him. So he tried to put such suspicions to rest through an official disclaimer to the University of Heidelberg dated 14th October 1933. In this disclaimer, Zimmer affirmed that he was aware that any kind of relationship, even an unofficial one, to the SPD or the KPD, the Social Democrats and the Communists, was forbidden. Zimmer's attempts at appearing to conform to the Nazi regime's political ethos led him to join the NSB, or Nationalsozialistische Volkswohlfahrt, the welfare organization of the Nazi Party, in 1935. Nazi propaganda had convinced many ordinary Germans that a membership in this organization contributed to making the Nazi ideal of Volksgemeinschaft or national community a reality. The national community was, of course, built on the nation of racial purity and ideological conformity. It included only those who belonged to who conformed to these and excluded those who did not belong to these categories. So the poster you can see here, the poster of NSB, it exhorts the Germans to become fighters for the NSB, to join the NSB as fighters in order to resist racial decline. It says literally the racial languishing and racial deterioration, presumably of the Aryans. Around the same time, Zimmer voluntarily enrolled at two other local organizations connected to the Nazi Party, the Defense Unit or Wehrkommando and the Reichsluftschutzverband, an association preparing the civilians for possible air attacks. In return, he received a wear pass or military pass that denoted his willingness to join an eventual war. This step was probably in tune with the fact that around the mid-1930s, the teaching and research at several departments of the University of Heidelberg began to be oriented towards military preparedness. Zimmer not only joined these organizations, he also sent certificates proving his membership of them to the Education Ministry in Berlin on 22nd June 1937. He also sent a separate certificate confirming that he had taken the oath of allegiance to the, within quotes, Führer on 18th March 1937. All government officials or Beamten had to take this oath at the time of assuming office. So taking this oath was not a sign of Zimmer's self-mobilization, but his voluntary memberships of the other organizations certainly denoted a level of self-mobilization. The certificates sent by Zimmer were attested by the Secretariat of the University of Heidelberg. This indicates that this institution provided him a certain degree of support. This solidarity reflected the university's approval of Zimmer's political compromises, as well as the concern of the university authorities to retain an internationally reputed scholar. The political differences between the academics at this prestigious university, most of whom were actually inclined to various forms of right-wing politics, as we noted, were often transcended by their self-image as members of an elite group of thinkers. It was this self-perception that prompted a number of academics to attempt to help Zimmer. Here I must mention another and more duplicitous act of complicity undertaken by Zimmer. I came across this episode just by chance at an archive in Berlin while researching the Indologist Ludwig Alsdorf, one of the protagonists of my forthcoming book. Zimmer was spying on Alsdorf for the Ministry of Education in Berlin during the International Orientalist Conference that took place in Rome in 1935. Alsdorf had then just finished his habilitation from the University of Berlin. However, the Education Ministry was having doubts about giving Alsdorf his teaching license or venia legendi, because though Alsdorf was a member of the Nazi Party, the ministry was not convinced of the sincerity of his commitment to Nazism. He was known as an opportunist. The Nazi regime, of course, wanted all future German professors to be reliable Nazis. So Zimmer was presumably asked to assess Alsdorf's devotion to National Socialism. In the report, which Zimmer signed as HZ, HZ in German, as you can see at the bottom of this letter, he stated that Alsdorf's academic competence was beyond doubt, but, I quote, "It does not appear likely to me that he could be termed a National Socialist," unquote. HZ expressed the hope that Alsdorf could be trained into becoming a committed National Socialist after the imminent appointment of the Indologist Bernhard Brelow, who was an ardent Nazi and SS functionary, quite a high-ranking SS man, as professor of Indology at the University of Berlin. HZ concluded that Alsdorf should receive his teaching license, which could be revoked later if necessary. I find it a matter of great irony that Alsdorf received his teaching license and never provided the Nazi authorities any cause to withdraw it. But Zimmer, who was spying on him on behalf of the Nazi regime, forfeited his right to teach at a German university. Now we come to the most interesting part of this story, at least for me, Zimmer's correspondence with Mila Esslinger, born Rauch, 1886 to 1972, which I had mentioned at the beginning of the talk. Around 1923-24, Zimmer began a relationship with Mila, who was married to a Swiss man called Eugene Esslinger. Zimmer and Mila corresponded from about mid-1920s until 1941, when America entered the war and Zimmer couldn't write anymore from the US. The hundreds of letters that I have read in the archives at Marbach provide fascinating glimpses into Zimmer's political orientation as well as his pragmatism. I say glimpses here, since politics was of course not the primary subject of these letters. I remember thumbing through these hundreds of letters and hoping fervently for comments on politics rather than, pages of sweet nothings. It was filled with a lot of passion. I still remember reading that Zimmer writes, Mila, you are as beautiful as an Indian goddess. And I thought, which Indian goddess then? Well, so a concrete proof of Zimmer's political inclination can be found in a letter from June 1932, a month before the national elections. Zimmer wrote that he and Christiane would vote for the Deutsche Zentrumspartei, which represented political Catholicism. The Zentrumspartei demanded parity of representation of all confessions in military, administration, and education, thereby indirectly helping the cause of the Jewish minority. The Nazis saw this brand of politics as potentially dangerous, and Hitler forced the Zentrumspartei to dissolve in July 1933. Another letter from July 1934 points to Zimmer's deep attachment to Catholicism as well as his aversion towards Nazism. Zimmer lamented that for the young people, Christianity had no significance compared to the brown wave, within quotes. It disgusted him that people could abandon the centuries-old tradition of Germany for, I quote, the so-called Nazi revolution against the party program of which everything else was superfluous, unquote. Here it is pertinent to mention that though Zimmer found Nazism unattractive, he was not free from prejudices about Jews. Phrases like, I quote, the doting love of a Jewish ghetto mama, unquote, or, within quotes, the cloying sweetness of Jewish petty bourgeois came up occasionally in his letters to Mila. In a letter written to 1936, he described his recent meeting with the Indologist Betty Hyman in London, where she had immigrated, as having to endure, I quote, the infantile self-aggrandizing of a little spoiled Jewish girl of about 48 years, unquote. So he was also rather misogynistic. Evidently, he regarded his wife Christiane not as a Jew, since she was raised a Catholic. The letters to Mila show Zimmer's increasing despondency as well as his desperation as he made public displays of loyalty to the Nazi regime while despising it in private. In March 1933, he wrote to Mila from Vienna that the situation there was probably conducive to a transmission of the politics from the Reich, within quotes. He had the premonition that, within quotes, both the immediate and the distant future looked troubled, unquote. Premonition turned to despair in the course of a year, as another letter to Mila, written in July 1934, shows. He wrote, I quote, I will not be able to shed the nightmare of the present situation soon, unquote. On that day, Zimmer had read in the newspaper about the purported suicide of Erich Mühsam, the Jewish origin left-wing political activist and writer, in the protective custody of the SS at Oranienburg near Berlin. Maybe he doubted whether he would ever be set free, wrote Zimmer, not knowing that Mühsam was actually murdered by the SS. However, Zimmer was not one to lose himself in despondency. In March 1933, he wrote to Mila that it was good that she and their children were relatively immune to the political waves in the countryside where they lived. He advised Mila to go to the church regularly so that she could ask for the parish priest's protection if the need arose. The situation was difficult for Mila as well, since Eugene Esslinger, her husband, and officially the father of the 3 children she had with Zimmer, was Jewish. In his professional life, Zimmer made constant concessions to realpolitik. A particularly prominent example of such compromises was a letter that he wrote to Mila on the eve of May Day 1934. He wrote that Heidelberg was full of swastikas in preparation for the May Day procession, in which he had decided to take part. He planned to listen to Hitler's speech afterwards. He also hoped that Mila would dutifully display the swastika at her window. It must be mentioned here that such political compromises were not rare among academics at the University of Heidelberg or in the German academia in general during the Nazi dictatorship. Few individual scholars dared to stand up against the regime. Zimmer continued to find ways and means to protect his lover and their children from Nazi persecution. In 1937, he wrote to Miller that it was opportune that their son Pepo, or Ernst Michael, was attending a boarding school in Freiburg in Switzerland because that was the smoothest way for him to acquire Swiss citizenship. 2 years later, from his exile in Oxford, he congratulated Miller for her successful divorce from her Jewish husband and advised her to give the children her own non-Jewish maiden name. This, he wrote, would speed up their obtaining the certificate of Aryan heritage or Arya Nachweis, which in turn would make it possible for Zimmer to send them money from his wife Christiane's account and with the latter's knowledge and consent. Christiane Zimmer seemed to have accepted the other woman in her husband's life with a surprising lack of animosity. She is actually the real hero of this story, and somebody should really research and write on her. She sent care packets to Mila from the US after Zimmer's death, and long after Zimmer's death, she kept in touch with Mila through letters. Well, in her situation, I would have sent Mila a letter bomb. Anyway, among the children, Pepo wrote to Zimmer in 1939 that he could become an Aryan. Presumably, so did the others. It is not illogical to wonder whether the accommodations made by Zimmer had any bearing on his being granted a degree of latitude that was denied to some of the others in a similar position, like Karl Jaspers. As we noted, Jaspers was forced into retirement earlier. From 1938 onwards, he was denied the right to publish in Germany. Zimmer, however, was allowed to publish even after his dismissal. In February 1938, the Central Education Ministry of Berlin let the rector of the University of Heidelberg know that Zimmer would receive his salary till the end of September 1938. That is, even after his teaching license had been rescinded. Interestingly, about a month before Zimmer's teaching license was withdrawn, he was invited by the Nazi Party officials to give a talk on Arthur Schopenhauer on the occasion of Schopenhauer's 150th birth anniversary in February 1938 at Danzig. Then Danzig was, of course, under German occupation. The event had a special significance for the Nazis since Hitler considered himself to be a disciple of Schopenhauer, and Alfred Rosenberg, the chief ideologue of the Nazi Party, personally organized this particular event. The talk given by Zimmer on 25th February 1938, titled Schopenhauer und die indische Philosophie, Schopenhauer and the Indian Philosophy, was published in the journal Nationalsozialistische Erzieher, a mouthpiece of the National Socialist Teachers Association. Zimmer included a copy of this publication in a letter dated 29th March 1938 that he sent to Karl Friedrich Schmidhuber, the head of the Lecturers Association of the University of Heidelberg. In this letter, Zimmer pleaded for the continuation of his stipend even after his teaching position and title were revoked. To bolster his case, he claimed that he had served the fatherland in different ways, as a frontline soldier in the First World War, as an academic whose scholarship was important for the Nazi regime, as proven by this article on Schopenhauer. This was not without effect. Schmidhuber did try to intervene with the university authorities on behalf of Zimmer, and maybe this contributed to the prolongation of Zimmer's stipend. The Nazi regime also allowed Zimmer to attend the Eranos conference in Ascona in Switzerland in the summer of 1938, though under strict surveillance. These conferences were held annually since 1933 as a meeting point of Eastern and Western religions and philosophies. C.G. Jung, whom Zimmer admired, was a regular here. Zimmer claimed that he stayed on in Germany so long because he wanted to see Jung every year. Unlike in the earlier years, however, in 1938, Zimmer was ordered to get in touch with the external cell of the NSDAP, the Nazi party, as well as with other German officials in Ascona, who would supposedly, I quote, assist him in his endeavors and his evaluating his stay, unquote. In other words, Zimmer was required to provide a report on the conference to the Nazi authorities. So we have here another instance of the espionage in which the Nazi regime kind of thrust on Zimmer. A secret memorandum in June 1938 from the External Affairs Ministry in Berlin to the Ministry of Education in Baden indicates that the university authorities of Heidelberg, particularly the Association of Lecturers, appealed in favor of Zimmer's restitution, primarily because he was a scholar of international standing. Nevertheless, one wonders whether this association would have appealed for Zimmer if he had not demonstrated his readiness to collaborate with the Nazi regime. The Ministry of Education at Berlin, however, was not ready to reinstate Zimmer, as a letter from this ministry to the university authorities dated 5th July 1938 shows. Before any final decision could be taken, Zimmer left for England. Zimmer's flight to England is intriguing and has several loose ends which I haven't been able to tie up. In the autumn of 1938, Zimmer had received an offer to hold an unpaid lecture at Oxford. On the basis of this invitation, with financial guarantee provided by Christiane's brother Raimundo von Hofmannsthal and his wife Alice Astor, who lived in England, Zimmer shifted to Oxford with his family in March 1939. In September 1940, that is more than a year after his departure, Nazi party functionaries started inquiring about his whereabouts to Paul Schmidt-Henner, then rector of the University of Heidelberg. The Nazi authorities evidently did not realize that Zimmer was leaving for good. This lapse on the part of the powerful Nazi surveillance machinery appears quite surprising to me, considering that Zimmer's migration was neither impulsive nor disguised. At the end of February, beginning of March 1939, Zimmer wrote to Mila that they gave their lawyer Eugen Gerhard all financial responsibilities, including the possible sale of their house, and also that they were taking many of their belongings with them. Zimmer also wrote about a farewell party given for them by some of his academic peers at Frankfurt am Main, implying that their imminent departure was not a secret. In a letter to the University of Heidelberg dated 16 September 1940, the lawyer Eugen Gerhard, along with two other lawyers, requested the university authorities to provide them a written confirmation of the Aryan Heritage Certificate that Zimmer had submitted to the institution. It is not known whether the university authorities complied, but it is likely that they did. The letter proves that the university authorities were quite aware of Zimmer's plans. However, in answer to the query of the Nazi officials, Schmidt-Henner wrote in October 1940 that Zimmer had gone for a visit to England last year and was probably held up by the war, and that he intended to return to Germany. This act of complicity with Zimmer on the part of Schmidt-Henner, who was a military historian and a member of the Nazi Party and the SS, and whose proclaimed aim was to turn the University of Heidelberg into the armorer of the Third Reich, signifies once again that Zimmer's political compromises were not without effect, and also that at times the perceived bond of intellectual elitism among the academics of the University of Heidelberg surpassed the imperatives of Nazi politics. Now I come to the conclusion of this paper. This story has tried to give an idea of the multifaceted ways in which academics could adapt to the political tenor of Nazi Germany. It has also pointed to the gray zones that existed within the established paradigms of complicity and persecution in the universities, thus raising questions about the popular view of helpless victims silently suffering under a monolithic Nazi regime. Zimmer's victimhood, he was beyond doubt a victim of Nazi racial politics, has precluded an examination of the compromises that he made and the variegated responses of the different representatives of the Nazi state to his compromises. After his untimely death in exile in 1943, Zimmer appeared all the more as a tragic figure, the quintessentially otherworldly scholar who was a defenseless target of oppression. The government of India has recently established the Heinrich Zimmer Chair for Indology at the University of Heidelberg in recognition of Zimmer's undeniably great contributions to his scholarly field and in acknowledgement of his trials and tribulations. Among all the eulogies and commiserations spent on Zimmer over the years, only Wendy Doniger has struck a different note by remarking very presciently that there was something of a chameleon in Zimmer. She was referring to his attempts to make himself more acceptable to the American academia by changing his name to Henry soon after his arrival at Columbia University in 1940. Zimmer's dynamism, his philosophical bent of mind, and powerful imagination made him capable of breaking new boundaries in his scholarship. In his life, he used these very qualities successfully to adapt to volatile political and personal circumstances. The nuances in his narrative are as much worth keeping in mind as his sufferings and achievements. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Roy, for that fascinating. No, I'm fine. Thank you. Fascinating sort of deep dive exploration to this one figure and the complexities of his character, which I think is important to address. We'll take questions both from the room and if you're on Zoom. You can either type your question into the chat and we will read it out, or if you prefer to read your question out or speak your question yourself, please just indicate that in the chat and we will come to you. For the time being, are there any questions in the room for Dr. William? Yes.
Were there similar cases, were there similar people, you know, in this kind of situation to Heinrich Zimmer? Were there others who also had to fight like mad to stay because they had a Jewish partner? The only person I can really think of who was quite unscrupulous is Alfred Anders, who divorced his Jewish wife just to become a member of the Schriftstellerbund. And then became a very well-known writer. I mean, I taught him works of A-level students. I can't think of anyone else apart. I mean, perhaps you can enlighten me.
Oh, I'm afraid no, because as I said, this was a side quest and I haven't really looked into this issue. But I know that there was an enormous pressure on people who had Jewish partners to divorce them. And a lot of people like your man did that. But Zimmer, you know, held on to Christiane, and I'm afraid cynical people would say that that was because of the lot of money that Christiane had. Hugo von Hofmannsthal's family was very rich. And I mean, that is a very cynical view of it. I would like to think that it was out of pure love, but well.
Yeah, thank you.
Unless there are questions from the online.
We'll take yours and then we'll go to the
Thank you very much. It's very interesting talk, a very interesting subject. I think it opens up several lines of inquiries in thinking, you know, alongside it. But I'm interested, well, I'm asking you two very basic questions, actually, nothing conceptual or anything about the way you conceptualize Zimmer, or perhaps a comment, which is, I think it shows, your paper shows very persuasively how you know, individual subjectivities are molded by these regimes, but also ways in which, you know, not just academics, but all manner of professionals make compromises in order to survive, and still do, you know, people survive despotic regimes and try to, by appearing to collude with them or least not getting it and hide behind certain facades. And I think there's a lot that can do with the subject. Two specific questions. One is about the point you made about Zimmer being spying on Ludwig Alsdorf. What is your evidence for that? Do you find evidence? Was he was he actually dispatched? And is there any correspondence regarding that? And the second question, I'm really interested in the correspondence between Heinrich Zimmer and Mila Esslinger. And so my question is about the corpus itself, since you had a look at it, and you say it's quite an extensive corpus. Does it consist entirely? Is that the entire Zimmer Nachlass, or it's just the correspondence between Esslinger and Zimmer? And does he talk about other things? And more importantly, do you have Mila Esslinger's responses to him? How did he engage with this? Because it seems to me that these are two individuals who are trying to, reimagine themselves and reconstruct themselves in this new order. And I was just wondering if it's about this. Very long question.
Very important questions. To your first question, it's Zimmer's handwriting there in the letter that I showed you. That HZ, I know this handwriting, his signature very well, because I looked at those hundreds of letters in the archives. And secondly, the circumstantial evidence also points to that, because it's very evident that it's a fellow Indologist who is in Rome. And Zimmer was the only other fellow Indologist with the name HZ who was in Rome and who was in a position to comment on Alsdorf's, intellectual or academic competence. And
what capacity was he doing this? Is that clear?
That is not clear. I just chanced upon this in Alsdorf's files at the Federal Archives in Berlin. I chanced upon this one letter to the ministry which says that, but it's very evident that, it's his signature and the circumstances. I know Zimmer was there in Rome. And to your second questions, this correspondence is just a part of the overall Nachlass, overall files. And as I said, it's a side quest, and I should have probably looked into other things, but I did not have the time, and I just wanted to concentrate on one aspect. So I saw a few other letters. Zimmer writes to this famous playwright, a Swiss playwright, saying that please do something for me. I want to go to India. So he writes to different people. There's also letters to Indians, Indian Indologists about something or the other. But what interested me was the Nazi connection. No, and Mila's responses are not there, because these letters were given to the archives by Mila's daughter Maya Rao, who's also passed away, and maybe for reasons of privacy she withdrew.
We have a question on Zoom from Kai Schiller. Professor Kai Schiller, or Kai, whenever you're ready, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that really interesting paper. It's I think more like a comment. Well, first of all, there was the question of whether there were other cases. There are two famous German actors, Hans Albers and Heinz Rühmann, who had Jewish wives and who separated under the pressure. So there are quite a few cases, I think, where that was the case, and where Zimmer wasn't really that different. I've just, I don't know, just looked. The other thing perhaps worth mentioning is you mentioned the von Hofmannsthal's wealth. There's also the point to be made that Zimmer and Christiane von Hofmannsthal were a couple, I think, from the early 1920s onwards, and they were quite famous in Heidelberg as a sort of society kind of society figures in Heidelberg. So they appear, I think, for example, in newspaper articles on a sort of local level, and so I wouldn't rule out love. And the other point perhaps worth making is that if you look, I just looked at images of Christiane von Hofmannsthal, and she was the exact sort of physical opposite of Mila. And to some extent, you know, I wonder whether there's a kind of sort of polyamorous sort of whether one could take a polyamorous view that, you know, he had this relationship and he was also obviously married and he had lots of children with both of them. So I thought that was interesting as well. But this is all in the realm of speculation. I'm not sure whether you want to comment on these points, but I just thought it's worth adding on to what you said. Thank you very much again.
I would like to share a little bit of gossip. I was given the information, not confirmed, that Zimmer had another lover at the University of Bremen. And somebody told me, go and see whether there are also hundreds of letters and 3 more children there. But I found that quite frightening, you know. I mean, they say a sailor has a wife at every port, but a university professor has a lover at every university. Is kind of very difficult to deal with for a researcher. So, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose gossip isn't gossip when it's historic. It becomes an important source evidence. We have another question on Zoom from Rudolf Moos. Please go ahead.
Hello, yes. Well, thank you very much. I found that very interesting, not least because I knew nothing about this before. However, I would like to add a comment, and that is bearing in mind countless analogous cases. I did not see in what you were saying any really serious compromises that Zimmer made with the regime. There's no attempt to join the Nazi party. There's no attempt, as far as you said, to join the Hochschulbund, the League of University Teachers. Membership in the NSV, Volkswohlfahrt, and Luftschutzbund were the bare minimum. And the Wehrkreiskommando is not an organization that you joined. It is an army registration of all men of military age. So that doesn't signify anything. So the way I interpreted what you said, and I have no specific information about his personal situation, is that he tried his damnedest to try and survive in Heidelberg without seriously engaging with the Nazi regime and its organizations, to try and continue leading a life sort of under the radar and do the bare minimum that might enable him to survive, especially as he did not regard, of course, his wife as Jewish, and the question of to what extent there was a sort of non-racial anti-Semitism underlying his understanding of the situation. So I would sort of scale the charge down a bit. Thank you.
If I may answer, well, you are right. These are not the worst things that one could do under the Nazi regime. Yes, but one should also remember that there were technical handicaps about Zimmer trying to join the Nazi party. He would not have been accepted either in the Nazi party or in the SS because he had a so-called Jewish wife. So he tried to enroll wherever he was still accepted. And yeah, I mean, it's okay, he was not standing guard at Auschwitz or something, but as I said, he demonstrated his willingness to join an eventual war, and it was his way of kind of showing that he was ready to. He had accepted the Nazi regime, he had accepted its militaristic goals, and so on. So he did what he could under the technical difficulties, the circumstances, the parameters. that he had. And no, I mean, I'm not reopening the Nuremberg trials or anything, but I do feel that it is actually a very tragic story. But I do feel that these are compromises, these are quite serious compromises on the part of a very serious humanist scholar who actually, I mean, who was forced by the circumstances to kind of compromise, make the compromises that he did.
Yes, I mean, if I can just ask a small question. The title of this lecture series overall is Outsiders, and I suppose initially I assumed that Zimmer was something of an outsider, maybe not within the academic community, but certainly in terms of the society in the Third Reich. But after hearing the lecture, I'm now wondering the extent to which that was the case, or whether the kinds of choices that he made actually make him quite a representative figure, albeit one, in a particular field with a particular profession. But these seem to be very kind of, how would you say, human things that the kinds of choices that with hindsight, appear very problematic indeed. To what extent do you think he represents the broader swathe of Nazi society in that respect?
As I said, I mean, he occupied a somewhat liminal space between victimhood and collaboration. And I think that would be true of a whole lot of people. I cannot imagine that he had been the only one to make this kind of compromises, but academically, he was certainly something of an outsider. He was an avant-garde because he started working on the kind of stuff which were kind of looked down upon. And his works reached a very wide audience. They are still read in translation in India. Some people tell me, oh, Zimmer, I learned about Indian art by reading his books. And that was at a time when people were reading the Vedas and doing, nouns and verbs and so on in Sanskrit. So academically, he was an outsider, and which is why he was never given a proper full professorship. If you look at it, he had this stipend, and he was just called professor, but he did not have a proper confirmed civil servant tenure. So that's there. And I would say that he was not at all an exception in what is exceptional is that he was a scholar and a humanist, or if you read his writings, a deeply humanist person. And for that kind of a person, being so anti-Semitic in a certain way, being so cynical in certain ways, that is somewhat, I find it that makes him something of an outsider. He's not just, just anybody. He's a trend-setting scholar. He's a humanist. He has a great love for, humanist ideals. And that kind of a person is spying on his junior, and, so that the regime makes him very cynical. And in that ways, I think, given who he is, he's something of an outsider politically too. He's in Zentrumspartei, which is banned by Hitler. So politically, he was kind of neither here nor there.
Any more questions from the room? Yeah.
I just wanted to conclude, one of the most extraordinary contradictions about the Nazi regime, and when you think that Hitler hated everything and everyone, yet he respected the family as a social unit. If you did not divorce your Jewish partner, that partner was, shall we say, safe. I know a lot of social pressure was put on the Aryan partner to divorce the Jew or the Jewess. And it's a Klemperer, he pays tribute to his wife, who was under severe pressure by the Gestapo to divorce the husband and never did. And there's one individual case, Gisela Wiesner, I read it, it was one of my little publications. She was half Jewish, her husband was Jewish, but she took part in that demonstration in March 1943 after Stalingrad, when they demonstrated for about a week, and Goebbels did not then deport the Jewish men. That's an extraordinary example of resistance during those severe times. I think Jeremy knows a long article about the Aryans and the Jews in their marriages, which we should perhaps look at. But I still can't believe this Hitler, who was insisting on Jewish children being killed right to the end of the war, and yet this family unit, if you were held together, he wouldn't do anything. This is extraordinary.
You're referring to the Rosenstrasse protest, I suppose. These protests were called the Rosenstrasse protest, and there's a very good film about this. I know only the film, but yes, I mean, as I said, this was a huge dilemma for the Nazis. So how can they kind of kill this Jewish person without punishing the Aryan partner? So it's a punishment for the Aryan partner, which the regime does not want. So it is a kind of one of the gray zones that that continued till the end, and there was no consistent policy, as far as I know.
Oh, I don't see any more questions on Zoom.
Sorry, it's been a very fascinating talk and a lot of food for thought. I would like to return to Zimmer as an Indologist, as an outsider, and perhaps raise 2 points. The first is that, I mean, when he was writing, it wasn't just, language studies that were the dominant feature of Indology. I mean, the Indology had become much more sophisticated discipline by the 1920s and 30s, and his predecessors, I mean, people like Fischer, writing in the early 20th century, early 19th century, early 20th century, they had already made that shift from language to studying religion, philosophy. Religion was back in the late 19th century. So, philosophy, drama, ancient poetry, Kalidas. This becomes quite a big thing. So I mean, perhaps I'd like to urge you to rethink that conceptualization. Maybe there is something there, but it may be somewhere else. The second thing is, I understand entirely the attraction of finding this material and finding an Indologist who is kind of in this liminal space. But what is it? What is the bigger point about Zimmer as an Indologist? What is specific to his profession, his practice as an Indologist that singles him out for study in this kind of conceptual framework of an outside? Do you think? Because if it happened to a whole lot of people, what is it? I mean, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that you trace it down to some, to a kind of a history of ideas or something in his writings or thinkings that you can, and I understand the ethical point that you're making, how can a humanist do this? But, I think history is full of a lot of humanists who are, quite happy to collude with very dodgy regimes. So what is it about Zimmer, the Indologist, that that would make this interesting for us, or interesting for you?
Well, to answer your second point first, as I said, that Zimmer was the quintessential victim. He is named by everybody as a victim of the Nazi regime. You talk about the victimized Indologist, his name crops up along with people like Otto Strauss or whoever, I mean, a whole lot of them. So this was my image of Zimmer. I have, of course, not really worked on his works. I'm not competent to answer that. But this was the image that I had. And then I had read this correspondence and it kind of totally shifted. He was, as I say, he was a victim, but he was not a silently suffering victim. He tried to battle his fate. So that was one point for me. And the second is, yes, I mean, of course, you know a lot better about the Indological part, the scholarly part of scholarly tradition of Indology. But Zimmer is, I feel, the one whose writings really reached beyond the academia. And he consciously wrote for popular audiences. He wrote a lot of newspaper articles. So he was in some ways a public intellectual in a way that people like, say, Pichel or maybe Luders, they were highly respected academics, but they never reached that kind of audience. So there was this image of this avant-garde, Indologist, and, the scholarly victim. It made a you look at the first photo that I showed you, you see this serene looking man, this scholar. So he's a victim, he's ousted and he holds true. I mean, he's true to his wife till the end. It all kind of adds up to a very romantic image. So I found it interesting to look a bit beyond that romantic image and see the nuances. He's still a victim, but there are nuances. And what was the other question? I'm sorry, did I answer both the points?
Great, thank you. Well, if there are no other questions, then I would just like to say before we close that there will be drinks, a few drinks outside in the Montague Lounge for those who are here in person. For those who attended on Zoom, thank you very much for your attention this evening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And so once again, let us thank Professor Baijayanti Roy for a fascinating lecture.